Hi, this is Nick Freitas, and welcome back to Making the Argument. And today we're going to address a question that I hear all the time. It has to do with why don't politicians follow the Constitution, right? And specifically, why don't politicians on the left follow the Constitution? Now, first thing I'll say right off the bat is both parties have been guilty of not actually properly interpreting and applying the Constitution, right? There's plenty of blame to go around on that, but you do see a lot more manipulation of the wording of the Constitution in order to justify the greater centralization of power in the hands of the federal government. And those arguments are usually coming from the left, right? And today, we're going to discuss 3 clauses within the Constitution that are often misinterpreted in order to give the federal government more power than it actually possesses within the text of the Constitution. It's very important to understand the context of why the Constitution was organized the way it was, why the Bill of Rights were put into place. Okay, again, Bill of Rights do not grant to you certain rights. It's a recognition that the federal government has no authority to infringe on those rights. And then they go so far as to say that just because a right isn't enumerated within the Bill of Rights, that doesn't mean that the federal government can do whatever it wants. It is supposed to only apply the authorities and responsibilities that are specifically outlined in the body of the Constitution. In the duties and responsibilities, the organization, and the restrictions on federal power, and then all of a sudden find ourselves in a world where the federal government thinks it can do just about anything, to include compelling you by law to buy health insurance, right? How do we get to that point? Or that the federal government now has a right to regulate your garden. Yeah, they might like the idea when they're ramming through something that they approve of. What happens when somebody else is in power and now they're doing something the left doesn't like? And they're saying, well, general welfare. What if a bunch of Republicans decided, what's in the best interest of the general welfare of the Republic? If everyone owned a firearm. And so therefore, we're going to allocate tax dollars to buy every single citizen a firearm that falls within those ages typically associated with the militia. We're going to use tax dollars to fund a firearm for every individual plus training. There would be a lot of people on the left who would be like, that's ridiculous. You don't have any authority to do that within Congress. And you know what? They'd be right. But if you're going to say necessary and proper, and if the only people that get to decide what necessary and proper are is Congress, if it doesn't fall within any boundaries of the restrictions or authorities that you've given Congress, well, then they can make anything necessary and proper. They became unmanageable because now you had diverse interests that were being represented, and what they wanted to try to do is create an environment where you didn't allow some strong man or some centralized authority to come in and dictate terms to everybody, especially when you had a diverse population with different concerns and different priorities. And so setting up a federalist system where the federal government had certain enumerated authorities, where state governments had a lot more authorities, and where we still protected individual liberty regardless of the authorities that we granted to the state or federal government. That was what they wanted because they recognized and they foresaw that as the United States grew, it would be a lot more difficult for 500 people in Washington, D.C. to effectively manage the concerns of 300 plus million people. They either wanted that reserved to the individual to make their own decisions within a free market and a free society, and if a law had to be made, they wanted to be made on the state level. The federal government was only supposed to work on those things which affected the republic as a whole and fell within the enumerated powers of the Constitution. And what I don't understand about this is that in this left-wing rush to completely water down or misinterpret these clauses, they're not just creating a bad situation for conservatives, they're creating a horrible situation for themselves. Because they're not always going to hold federal power. And one day, federal power might be held and executed by people that have far different intentions than the current makeup of Congress. How do you define when a particular policy is good or bad? Is it simply majority rules? Because contrary to what a lot of the people on the left will tell you, we're not a pure democracy. We were never intended to be. The emphasis on the whole foundation of the American experiment is not just democratic elections. It's an emphasis on individual liberty and restraining government power so that individual liberty could thrive, so that you could pursue happiness in accordance with your definition of it, not an elected member of Congress or a member of the executive branch. And so if we can get back to explaining that side of the Constitution, that why those restrictions on federal power are important, not because we don't want good things done, but because we recognize that different localities, different states, different individuals are going to have different ideas about that. And the more we can expand individual liberty, the more we can allow people to be free to make their own decisions, learn from the consequences of their actions, whether they be good or bad, and then adopt their behavior appropriately. That's a free society. Not the federal government completely expanding the definitions of these three clauses within the Constitution, while at the same time ignoring the very restrictions that were put in place in order to preserve a free society.